It was the summer of 1945. The guns had finally gone silent across Europe. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed into rubble and ash. But the silence that followed was not peace, it was exhaustion. Entire cities had been reduced to graveyards. Millions of displaced people wandered roads that led nowhere. And scattered among the refugees, the ruins, and the chaos were men who had committed unimaginable crimes. Men now desperately trying to blend into the wreckage of the world they had destroyed. Some would be hunted down and tried at Nuremberg. Some would escape to South America, and some, like Oskar Dirlewanger, would meet a far more personal reckoning, one that history would struggle to fully document for decades to come. Oskar Dirlewanger was born in 1895 in Würzburg, Germany. On paper, he was an educated man. He held a doctorate in political science. He had fought in World War I and was decorated for bravery, but beneath that thin veneer of respectability lived something deeply, disturbingly broken. He was a convicted child molester. He was a violent alcoholic. He was a man whose cruelty extended far beyond the battlefield. Even within the brutal world of the Nazi SS, Dirlewanger stood out, not as a soldier, but as a sadist. Senior SS officers described him as abnormal and dangerous. Complaints were filed, investigations were opened, and yet because of one powerful friend, SS General Gottlob Berger, Dirlewanger kept his position, kept his command, and kept killing. In 1940, the SS had an unusual idea. Why not take the most violent convicted criminals in German prisons, poachers, thieves, murderers, and turn them into soldiers? The result was the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit so feared and so reviled that even other SS formations refused to operate alongside them. Dirlewanger handpicked his men from prison cells and concentration camps. He did not want disciplined soldiers. He wanted men with nothing to lose and no conscience to hold them back. The unit grew over time, eventually absorbing Soviet POWs, foreign collaborators, and other criminal elements. What held them together was not ideology. It was not patriotism. It was the permission, the explicit, sanctioned permission to do whatever they wanted to, whoever stood in their path. Deployed to Belarus and occupied Poland, the Dirlewanger Brigade left a trail of annihilation that shocked, even hardened, Wehrmacht commanders. Entire villages were burned to the ground, with the inhabitants still inside. Men, women, and children were herded into barns that were then set on fire. Those who tried to escape were shot. Survivors were tortured. The brigade's operations were not about fighting partisans, they were about terrorizing a population into submission through the most extreme violence imaginable. German army commanders sent formal written complaints to Berlin. They begged for the unit to be reined in or disbanded. Those complaints were ignored. Dirlewanger's kill counts were celebrated by the SS leadership. By some estimates, the brigade was responsible for the deaths of over 30,000 civilians in Belarus alone. In August 1944, the Polish underground rose up against Nazi occupation in what became known as the Warsaw Uprising, one of the most heroic and heartbreaking acts of resistance in all of World War II. The Nazi response was swift and merciless, and leading the charge into the most densely populated civilian districts was Dirlewanger and his brigade. What they did in Warsaw defies easy description. Hospitals were stormed and patients were bayoneted in their beds. Women and children were used as human shields. Priests were executed in their churches. Entire neighborhoods were cleared not through combat, but through massacre. Polish historians estimate that in just the first few days of the suppression, the Dirlewanger Brigade was directly responsible for the murders of at least 40,000 civilians in the Wola district alone. It was not warfare, it was a genocide conducted street by street. By late 1944, the tide of the war had turned irreversibly against Germany. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east like a tidal wave of vengeance. Allied forces were pushing from the west. The Nazi Empire was crumbling. Dirlewanger's brigade was thrown into the desperate last-ditch defense on the Eastern Front and was shattered. Dirlewanger himself was badly wounded in fighting in early 1945. As Germany's defeat became certain, the elaborate machinery of Nazi power, the SS, the command structure, the entire apparatus of terror, dissolved almost overnight. Soldiers shed their uniforms. Officers burned their papers. The men who had wielded absolute power over life and death were now running for their lives, terrified of the reckoning that was coming. Dirlewanger knew exactly what he had done, and he knew exactly what capture meant as Germany collapsed. Around him, he did what countless other Nazi war criminals attempted. He tried to vanish. He shed his SS uniform. He assumed a false identity. He moved through the chaos of a defeated nation, hiding among the millions of displaced and desperate people flooding the roads of post-war Germany. For a brief few weeks, it seemed as though he might actually succeed. The post-war chaos was immense. Allied forces were overwhelmed with prisoners, refugees, and the sheer scale of the catastrophe they were now responsible for managing. In that confusion, men like Dirlewanger had a window, a narrow, desperate desperate window to slip through the cracks of history and escape justice forever. That window slammed shut in June 1945. French occupation forces apprehended Dirlewanger in the small town of Altshausen in southwestern Germany. Whether he was identified through intelligence, recognized by someone who knew him, or simply caught in a routine sweep remains a matter of some historical debate. He was taken into custody and placed in a local prison. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. There was no formal announcement. The man responsible for tens of thousands of deaths was simply locked in a cell, physically diminished, still recovering from his wounds, and entirely at the mercy of his captors. Among the guards assigned to watch him were Polish soldiers, men from the very nation whose people he had slaughtered with such casual industrial efficiency. What happened inside that prison in the days that followed is not fully documented in any official record, and that itself tells you something. Witnesses later described sounds coming from Dirlewanger's cell at night, the sounds of a man being beaten, systematically, repeatedly. Over the course of several nights, Dirlewanger was reportedly subjected to severe physical abuse at the hands of guards. Some accounts suggest the beatings were carried out by Polish soldiers who knew precisely who he was and precisely what he had done to their countrymen. There was no intervention. There were no orders to stop. The prison command either could not or would not protect him. For a man who had built his entire career on inflicting suffering on the defenseless, he now found himself utterly defenseless, and the suffering was being returned to him in kind. On June 7, 1945, less than a month after Germany's unconditional surrender, Oskar Dirlewanger was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed vaguely, the paperwork deliberately imprecise. He was 49 years old. There was no trial. There was no last statement. There was no grave marker that anyone would visit with flowers. The man who had ordered the burning of thousands of people alive died alone, beaten in a prison cell, without the dignity of a formal execution and without the recognition of a proper judicial reckoning. For many survivors of his crimes, there was grim satisfaction in the manner of his end. For historians, there was frustration, because without a trial, without testimony, without a full legal accounting, the complete record of his crimes was never formally entered into the permanent record of history. For years after the war, rumors circulated that Dirlewanger had not actually died in that cell, that the body found was a decoy, that he had escaped, that he was living quietly somewhere in South America like so many other Nazi fugitives. These rumors persisted with enough force that in the 1960s, West German authorities launched a formal investigation into the circumstances of his death. Witnesses were interviewed, records were examined, and ultimately, investigators concluded that Dirlewanger